When he got on stage, this was the future Eric Carr. This is his passion. This is what he loves. But I think when you take him off stage, then he becomes that shy person. And he was also a very humble person as well. And everyone I've talked to about Eric all the way through his entire career have always said he remained humble.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Online at bookedonrock.com, where you can find every episode along with links to listening platforms, exclusive videos, blogs, and the latest rock book releases. Janet Symmons is this episode's guest. The book is called The Rise of the Fox, 1950 to 1982, The Extraordinary Life of Kiss's second drummer, Eric Carr Revealed. The Rise of the Fox is part of the Eric Carr Revealed series, a comprehensive and unauthorized biographical series that explores the life and times of Kiss's second drummer, Eric Carr. It's an essential read for Kiss fans, hard rock fans, and anyone who loves a compelling rags-to-riches story. It digs deep into the life and career of the late great Eric Carr, who was the drummer of Kiss from 1980 right up until his untimely death in 1991. Author Janet Symmons draws on hundreds of sources, including rare interviews with Eric, documents from Kiss management, and exclusive interviews with people who witnessed Eric's amazing journey. She's here to share some of what's in the first volume, covering the years 1950 to 1982. To hear a playlist of Eric Carr era Kiss, head over to the show notes page. Janet, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Eric. It's a pleasure to be here.
This is the most comprehensive look at Eric Carr. What we're going to talk about today is Volume 1, which covers the years 1950 all the way up through 1982. So let's go back to Eric's childhood days. Can you talk about where Eric Carr, then known as Paul Caravello, grew up and how music wasn't actually his first passion? He had an interest in art, and I think he also wanted a career with NASA.
Yes, well, I think it was Freedom 7, Freedom 9. It was one of the Freedoms. They went up before the Apollo missions, and he saw this go up, and he's like, wow, I want to do that. And he was very scientifically minded. He was scoring 90s in geometry, and he's a smart guy, and algebra and those types of things. So he had this natural ability to do that, and he wanted to do that. But then one day in February 1964, just like so many other people, they were watching the Ed Sullivan Show, and I think you alluded to that in the previous podcast with Ken Womack.
I probably mentioned that in so many episodes. It's so true. February of 64. What got you into music? The Beatles on Ed Sullivan. It's amazing.
Beatles on Ed Sullivan. And that's exactly what happened with Paul Caravello, the future Eric Carr. He saw that, and he basically threw out all of his ideas of what he wanted to do, and he just started to focus on that. He wanted to be Ringo. He wanted to be just like his hero. And he saw Ringo wasn't necessarily mobbed by the girls like Paul McCartney because of the cute looks. I'm not disparaging Ringo whatsoever, but the comparison, right? And Paul Caravello was a very shy young man. So I think that also helped him gravitate toward, hey, I can do this. This looks like fun. Everyone likes Ringo, but he's not exactly getting mobbed. So he's a little bit to the back as well and up. So he does have a little bit of, protection in front of him, if you know what I mean, by having people there. So yeah, he took the pots from the kitchen, right? And here comes the drum set. And, his dad gave him a few books, and he's stomping on the floor for the bass drum. And his dad actually made a piece of wood with a piece of rubber on it, and he could use that as a snare. And that's what got him started. He was just so immersed in it, and that is what he wanted to do. And that's what he did.
Yeah, it was like an obsession with him to master the drums. And at one point, he played, 3 bands in 2 years. Talk about the bands that he played and how many.
Let me start counting, because he started off in 1964 with the band called The Allures, and no one really even knows their name because they were only around for a few months. And then he started another band called The Cellarmen because they practiced in his cellar. And that only lasted a few months, but he did write 2 songs with the bassist for the Cellarmen, but they just broke apart. And then he started the Cellarmen basically part 2 because they couldn't afford to change the name that he had printed on his bass drum. So
all New York bands, by the way, right? He's from New York.
He's from Brooklyn. Yeah, he's from
Brooklyn, yeah.
Brooklyn, born in 1950. So yeah, he met these other couple of people, and soon they had the Salomon going, and that lasted for a few years until they fell apart. And they're just a copy band. They're not doing anything original. They did go into the studio a couple of times to record the two songs that the original Salomon did, and Paul Caravello sang lead on both of them. But nothing ever came of them. They were just acetates. They made them into a few 45s and disseminated them to DJs in the area, but they didn't get any airplay. Nothing ever went anywhere. So they eventually fell apart. Then he was in a band called Smack. Then he was in another one called Things That Go Bump in the Night. Can you imagine making posters and putting on that? It's just too long, too long. And then he went into another band called Salt and Pepper, and that was 1970. And from there, it was basically the same band all the way through. It just changed names and personnel changed a bit here and there. But that was all the way through up until 1979. He was basically working with the same people.
And this is what's so interesting when we get into the person that Eric was. He didn't seek help from a booking agent, which is interesting because he's clearly hungry to make it. And there are various speculations as to why, but his sister feels that Eric was shy and didn't think he was good enough. I mean, what do you make of that, him not getting the booking agent?
Well, I think that's two different questions there, because one is really about his personality, being shy. But I think when he got behind the drum kit, I don't think he was shy anymore, because this is what he wanted to do. When he got on stage, this was the future Eric Carr. This is his passion. This is what he loves. But I think when you take him off stage, then he becomes that shy person. And he was also a very humble person as well. And everyone I've talked to about Eric all the way through his entire career have always said he remained humble. So I think that has a part to do with it right very back at the beginning. And as for the booking agent, I really don't understand that, because he, like you said, he's hungry to make it. He really, really wants it. It's his driving. It's his passion. And he leaves bands, or bands fall apart, and other people are talking to the booking agent, but he doesn't. And I was scratching my head at this. It's like, what are you doing? Don't you really, really want this? Well, of course he does, because this is what he's driving for. But it's also the same conundrum he's in during the 70s. Why is he staying in a copy band for 9 years? It just made absolutely no sense to me. I'm not too sure what was going on in his head at the time. I wish I could talk to him and find out.
Right.
He wouldn't have found out about the audition unless he had run into the former keyboardist for Flasher. Paul Torino had quit the band in February, and they just happened to be in the same bar at the beginning of June later that year. But if Paul Caravello really wanted to make it, why didn't he have all of his networking friends out there saying, are there any opportunities? There was none of that happening. And what's also strange is he's always in cover bands. There's very few opportunities to go into the studio and actually make something original, because I think they recorded, I'm going to guess at the top of my head, about 12 songs. And perhaps half of them were cover songs. You're never going to get a record deal. I mean, cover songs, it's just not going to happen. So something's going on there. He wants to make it, but he's not moving towards that as focused as he should have been. It was luck, really, that he ran into Paul Torino that night at the club and was told about the audition, because Paul Torino was very connected. And so he heard about it and automatically thought of his friend Paul Caravello. There was something there, I think, that was holding him back, because he again talked to his friend Paul Torino and said, I need help with the demo, which to me says he's still not connected with other people in the industry. And then he puts everything together. He's got the demo together, gets everything together in 3 days, puts it in an orange envelope, and then sits on it for an extra day. The deadline was Monday. He dropped it off on Tuesday. But hang on, he had it ready Sunday night.
The bright orange envelope.
The bright orange envelope, yeah. So what's going on there? So if it's all together, all he had to do is drive it down into Manhattan and drop it off.
Yeah.
Your guess is as good as mine why he didn't do that.
Yeah, and we should know too, he's about to turn 30, so he's thinking time's almost up. Maybe the music business isn't for me. And he's repairing stoves during the day because his father had a stove repair business, right?
Yeah, he was working part-time at Jamaica Stove. I'm not too sure if it was his father owned the business or worked in the business. His father had a lot of different jobs, He was working in a sheet metal factory. He was delivering appliances, all sorts of stuff. So he moved around different jobs. He was trying to make money for to keep the family afloat. But at that time in 1979, he's fixing gas ranges. There's stories in there of, getting cockroaches everywhere and all this fun stuff that you can just imagine if working in the unpleasant places in Brooklyn and Queens.
In the pre-internet days, he buys Unmasked the next day to get the management
Yes.
company contact info. That's
Because he
old
didn't
school.
have it. He didn't have any Kiss records. So he
Yeah.
was immersed in disco at the time. In 1977, he went to the Commodore show at Madison Square Garden, and he said that's really what solidified what he wanted to do. And I'm like, really? You've been doing this for since 1963, and this is the one that did it? I mean, the Commodores then they were huge. Lionel Richie's doing Easy and all these other great songs. You would have thought that if he was into rock and roll because he loved Bonham, he loved Ginger Baker. That was his that's what got him really going into that double bass. And all of a sudden he's doing disco and funk. Why wasn't he going to the gardens to see Kiss? Because they'd sold out Madison Square Garden back in 77 as well. So why wasn't he going to do these things? So there's a lot of questions that we'll never be able to answer, but these things haven't been brought up in other books or movies or anything before. So it's kind of interesting to have that, like the curtain drawn back so you can see what's going on.
I love the details regarding the criteria required to be in Kiss.
So they wanted someone who was single, who wasn't into drugs or alcohol, who was basically a quiet personality that had no ties to anything. And Eric fit all that. The sheet that was given to Bill Aucoin, he has checked off that he plays double bass. So they were looking for that. He's single, check mark there. He has no photos anywhere. He has no contracts anywhere. It's check mark, check mark, check mark. Quite a list of things that people like Carmen Appice, because apparently he was interested in becoming a Kiss drummer for a little bit. He couldn't have met those requirements because he had his picture out there. Very few people could have done what Eric Carr did and meet those requirements.
There was the cover letter or on the resume or something that he wrote and put in that envelope. He was making it clear that he's somewhat well known, but certainly not famous. Like he wanted to make sure that they knew that.
He played Disney World. He played Tomorrowland. It was apparently a huge disco show. It was kind of traveling around disco shows. So he was on there with the Tramps. They had a song on the Saturday Night Fever album, so they were doing quite well at the time. BT Express, and I can't remember who else. But yeah, so he played in front of a few thousand people. But really, if you think about disco at the time, it's almost like a DJ, right? The band is like the DJ, and every now and again you look up and go, oh, yeah, they're still playing, because you're too busy dancing, you're too busy jumping around. You're not really focused on what the lead singer's doing or, that kind of thing. So the focus definitely was not on Paul Caravello, who's sitting at the back of all of this, the stage on his drums. He wasn't the focus. It was the dancing was the focus. But by putting that on his resume, he's in a way saying, I can play in front of people. I have no problem. I can do more than just a club of 100 people. I don't have stage fright is basically what he's saying. And his resumes also gave examples of who his main people were. Ginger Baker and John Bonham. He has these wonderful influences. But then he also puts in Lenny White. Oh, well, hang on. Where's that coming from? He's a jazz drummer. So he's also saying, I'm kind of fluid, I understand different genres. And then he names off bands as well, such as the Cars and the Knack. When he was in Flasher, he was playing those songs. So he's in the cover band. So he was quite familiar with the new wave music at the time.
And he had just 3 days to put that demo tape together. I never knew about his audition tape, including Van Halen songs. And as you may see behind me here, I'm quite the fan of Van Halen.
I saw that, yes.
Yeah. Can you talk about what was included on the tape and the Kiss song? Beth was the one he was going to put on there, but he said no.
Actually, they recorded Beth as a demo tape. And it was afterwards they kind of scratched their heads, because there's 3 people in there. They got Paul Torino is there, Paul Caravello, and another person named Paul who owns the studio. How confusing can that be? Right? So they decided that no, we can't put Beth on here because that was Peter's song. And they're not going to sing Beth anyway. They're not going to do that in concert. So let's show off Paul Caravello's voice with a different song. And Paul Torino heard Paul Caravello do Beth, and he said, holy crap, it sounds just like him. This is great. Which is kind of interesting because down the road in 1988, as Eric Carr, he winds up recording Beth on Smashes. So
When I first heard that, I didn't know it was Eric. I didn't look at the credits, just listen the cassette at the time.
mhm.
And I was like, boy, that sounds like Peter. It sounds a little different, but maybe they did something with Peter's voice, but it was so similar, I thought, at least.
It was similar, but a bit smoother.
Yeah,
Yeah,
smoother. Yeah.
because you could say that Peter sounded he's got that gravelly voice, almost like a Rod Stewart kind of thing. But Eric's voice, he can also do that. I mean, you could hear it when he sings Black Diamond, when he does that live. You can hear that gravelly voice, but he can also sing very smooth. And when he did Shandy, going back to your question about the demo, when he did Shandy, which was Paul Stanley's song, he sung that very smooth. And that was the only song on the demo tape that he actually sang. All the other 3 songs he played the drums on.
And the 2 Van Halen songs were?
And the Cradle Rock and You Really Got Me.
Yeah. And Torpedo Girl, he also did the Ace song.
Yeah, I love the drum pattern on that. And that was
Oh, yeah.
originally Anton Fig was the drummer for
Yes.
that one. He didn't pick an easy song to do. It's not like just steady 4/4. Yeah, he picked an intricate one, which it shows off what he can do. But also by including those 2 Van Halen songs, he's also saying, hey, I like the harder stuff. In a way, that's like sending a message because he's saying, okay, here's 2 songs from Unmasked. I can do this kind of new Kiss sound, if that's what you want to call it. And I can also do the harder stuff. Once again, it's interesting that he chose those 2 Van Halen songs. They were part of the set list for Flasher, so he's used to playing those. He was very familiar with them. But it's also interesting why he didn't choose an older Kiss song, one of the harder songs, harder edge sound to include as well. So his choice says something.
So fascinating to get all these details. Like, for example, there's a myth that he drove to the office of Bill Aucoin on a bicycle. Not true?
Not true. I originally read that way back in the 80s. I found it somewhere I think it was a fanzine or something. I can't remember where I found it. So I had to dig into this. It was only a few months, probably about a year ago, that I found that no, he'd actually driven his car there. There was a witness from Bill Aucoin's office who directed, Paul, go take your car and park it down there. And he said there's stove parts popping out of almost the windows, So he's not there on his bike. He's borrowed the the vehicle for work.
That's even a better story to me. It's just, you can picture that like a movie scene, and he pulls up in this beat up old vehicle and the stove repair parts are hanging out. Yeah.
Beat up old Volkswagen it was. Yeah.
Volkswagen, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this. Janet Symmons is the author of The Rise of the Fox, 1950 to 1982, The Extraordinary Life of Kiss's second drummer, Eric Carr Revealed. Eric begins the auditioning process with Kiss. They pared the list of potentials down to Eric and a drummer named Bobby Rondinelli. The 2 face off in a second audition. Eric comes back for a third audition. It was a close call. What finally led to the band picking Eric over Bobby, and what became of Bobby Rondinelli?
It was neck and neck. People were back and forth. It's like, gee, they're both really good drummers. They both can fit. And I think it came down to the simplicity of Eric's approach to the songs. Eric does say he heard another drummer. He doesn't name who it is, but how the auditions were set up, it had to have been Bobby, that he was putting too many, he was making it too fancy, too many fills. That is why Gene and Ace were like, yes, it's got to be this Paul Caravello guy. And Paul Stanley was sitting on the fence a bit, and we don't know why. But eventually he decided, yeah, okay, we'll hire this Paul Caravello guy. And as for Bobby, he wound up, where did he go? He went to Blue Oyster Cult. He went to Rainbow. He's had a very good career. I don't know what he's doing now. But it's interesting that he had an offer to work with Rainbow, Richie Blackmore's Rainbow, at the same time that he was auditioning for Kiss. What should I take? You can just see the wheels going in his head. He decided that he was going to take the Rainbow gig instead of the Kiss gig. And it worked out well because all of a sudden he gets this letter saying, thanks, but no thanks. We've moved on. And they hired Eric Carr. But in Kiss, they don't know that Bobby's no longer available. Eric Carr doesn't know that his competition is no longer in the rearview mirror. So the pressure's on. You got to do it because we don't want to go back. We don't have time to pull Bobby in. But if things do fall apart with this new guy, we could probably bring Bobby in. Eric is probably also thinking, geez, if I mess up, they're just going to go to the number 2 guy. I got to get this right. There's a huge amount of pressure on everyone in KISS, the organization, for those few weeks in July leading up to the debut show on July 25th. He's hired on July 1st. So it's very, very little time to get into, become a KISS person, a KISS persona that quickly.
There is one thing that he does at that audition, I think, that maybe makes the difference. Clearly he's got the talent, but there's something that he does at that audition that speaks to his down-to-earth personality. He asks to get the autographs, Paul, Gene, and Ace.
This is the first audition. He's done his bit, and it's like, geez, I hope I'm good enough. You can probably see this going on in his head. Geez, I hope I'm good enough. They might not call me back. I better get this audition letter autographed because I may never see them again. So he turns around and asks them for their autograph, and they're just floored by it. Maybe because no one else had done that. The drummers that had come in prior to Paul Caravello being there hadn't asked that. And he was just down-to-earth guy. So it's like, yeah, well, I'll just ask and see what happens. And he got that. And little did he know that a few days later, he'd be called back for a second audition. At that point, they were working really well together because during the first audition, KISS hadn't been playing a whole lot. So they were a little rusty during the audition process. So if you're not a very good drummer, you're trying to figure out, why is KISS playing rusty? You know what I mean? Eric comes in, he's listened to the wrong versions of the songs. He's listened to the album cuts as opposed to the live cuts. So he's playing the same songs differently. So they're starting to work together. You can see that they are working together as a band as opposed to this is an audition.
So how does Paul Caravello become Eric Carr with 2 R's?
He immediately thinks, well, I have to change my name. He knows there cannot be another Paul in the band because we have Paul Stanley. So he decides, okay, my last name, I'm going to just chop it down to the first syllable and add an extra R. So it's very much like Ringo Starr did. He's Richard Starkey. So just chop it back a bit, add an extra R. And his girlfriend, Pantera, had made a list of possible names. And they went through them. How does this sound with the last name Carr? And they tried those names out. But Eric was he knew how everything sounded. So he was looking for a name that had 2 syllables at the first name and 1 syllable for the last name, because that's what Peter had. So he is trying to really fit in. He didn't want to have 1 syllable for his first name, 2 for the last, because it wouldn't sound right, as he said. It wouldn't sound right when you said the band's name. He eventually settled on Eric. He wanted it to sound right, and he also wanted it to look right. So he's being very meticulous, extremely, extremely detailed on his whole approach so he can fit in seamlessly with the band, because this is the most important thing to him now. Everything else doesn't matter. He wants this gig. He wants everything to be perfect. He can see his life future here. So don't mess it up at the beginning. You have to have that solid foundation. And that's what he was thinking. He wanted those details down. So that's how he came up with Eric Carr. Just he truncated his last name, and his girlfriend made a list, and that's the one he chose.
Now, he was initially to be the Hawk. How does he go from the Hawk to the Fox? And like you say, there's not much time here, so they got to really figure something out fast.
So he gets a phone call on July the 1st. Congratulations, you're now a member of KISS. He phones up his friend Paul Torino, who helped him get the gig, found out about the gig, and recorded the demo, and yay, we're all happy. I think he probably went to meet with Bill Aucoin's management team, get all the paperwork all sorted out that day, and then he went out with his friend Paul Torino that night, and they celebrated a little bit. And then you've lost basically a day. So July 1st is done. So now he's on a timeline to get everything together. And he's thinking he has until the middle of August. I think it was August 9th, when KISS was supposed to go off on a Mexican tour. Nobody knows it at the time, but that's about to be canceled, and they're going to move his debut up to the 25th. They don't know that until later on in the week. So he is he's in that celebratory mood, and he goes into the Aucoin office and he says, we need a character, and this is what we have in mind. Because they were already thinking of different characters for the persona prior to hiring any drummer. They were talking about it in the middle of June. So I believe that they had a rough costume ready to go, and it was a hot costume. So Eric tries this on, sometime in the next couple of days. So it's going to be July 2nd to 3rd. He's trying the hawk costume on. There's photos of him in it. And you can actually, he's holding up his arms so you can see this is what I look like in this pose and this pose. And he's trying a few things. And you can actually see strings dangling down from it. So it's a very rough costume. It's like almost like a prototype. It was made to fit anybody. So they could probably fix it for whatever body shape that person was, or height, or whatever. And then the next photos of him are different photos of the hawk face, and they're only from the side view. So one is left profile and the other one's right profile. And I was looking at it and I think, you know what? He's put half one side of makeup as one design and the other side is another design. And they just took profile photos to see which one is which. They finally settle on one, and you can find that it's just a straight on headshot of him wearing in a black t-shirt. But if you look at his hair, he still has that Paul Caravello hair's going everywhere kind of thing. It's not the Kiss haircut. So that to me says that was done very early in the timeline, probably the first couple of days. He probably got his hair cut and dyed on the weekend, and it was Independence Day on the weekend as well. So you also have this, you're not going to get your hair done then probably because it's all closed down, right? So we're losing days at this point. And at some point, he stands there in Brooks, which is a costume design theater design company. They're standing there and Paul Stanley and Bill Aucoin are sitting there looking at him going, this doesn't look right. He's dressed all in yellow feathers. It looks ridiculous. And you could take off the chest piece. And as Eric described it, he looked like the San Diego chicken. You know, he's like Big Bird for Pete's sake, right? You take off this chest piece and his jumpsuit, whatever you want to call it, the leotard one piece, it's yellow at the top. I mean, like, what were you thinking, guys? But what gets me is they've also gone away from the whole essence of Kiss, because the guys who are wearing this makeup, this is supposed to be who they are on the inside. This is their personality coming out. Like Gene Simmons is the demon. We have absolutely no doubt that this is true, right? No doubt. That is who he is on the inside. That's another part of his personality. You cannot just give someone, here, go be a hawk, go be a this, go be that, because that runs against what the essence of Kiss is. So Paul Stanley and Bill Aucoin say, no, this is ridiculous. They get rid of the hawk idea, and now Eric has to start from scratch, which is absolutely perfect for him, because now he has to think about, very quickly too, about what's happening inside of him and who he wants to be and how to actually create this in makeup. But also around this time, this is when he finds out that, guess what? His debut is now going to be July 25th, because they're running into financial issues. This is running up the bills and they don't have any money coming in. So we better get a couple of shows going here. So now he's moved up that date. Now the pressure's really on. We don't have the exact timeline of what's happening during the following week from basically the 5th to the 12th. The 12th is his birthday. He'd be 30 then. But by then, we know that he has adopted the name Eric Carr. And we also know that he has the Fox persona figured out at that point, because in his birthday card that he gets from the people at Aucoin Management, they refer to him as Eric, and two people also refer to him as Fox. So that's an indication that by the 12th, we can even say by the 11th, because no one's going to sign a birthday card on the day of. They usually have it circulating throughout the office, right? At least probably the day before. So we can say probably by the 11th, we knew he had his name, Eric Carr, and he was a Fox at that point. So sometime between, I would guess, the 5th or the 6th of July and the 11th, he had come up with his new persona.
So fast, that timeline.
Well, he didn't have time to waste. He said he was in the Palladium, backstage at the Palladium, because Kiss had rented out that venue for rehearsal purposes as well. And he was just drawing on a piece of paper that was like egg-shaped, drawing on it as a face. And then he's just doodling, trying to get the makeup correct. So it was very quickly that happened. And at one point, he just turned around to Gene Simmons and said, what do you think of this? And they said, looks like a fox. Great, this is perfect. So that's when he really started working on creating that fox makeup. By the time he's at the Palladium show on the 25th of July, he has everything together. He's got the costumes together, he's got the makeup together. And there was this brouhaha, basically, of everything's going to fall apart if we don't have Eric Carr together by this date. That's what I'd heard for so many years. But when you think about it, we have a photo shoot scheduled for a couple of days before that. And that was for the People magazine photo shoot. Everything had to be together for that. It wasn't for the Palladium show. And that's actually the first time you see Eric Carr wearing the orange fox jacket and the boots. Before that, only photos of him wearing his black jumpsuit are seen.
The details of his contract are interesting too. How much was it for? How long was it for? Because he felt like he had won the lottery, but it was more like he was an employee, not really a member of the band. It was kind of one-sided.
Well, yeah, it was one-sided, but I mean, we wouldn't have Eric Carr unless he signed that contract. At that point, he had agreed, and it was in writing in the contract, that he'd only made $10,000 playing the clubs. Now, this is in 1980, so you'd have to figure out what it is today. It's somewhere in the book. But he'd only made $10,000 over those last 3 years playing the clubs. And now, wow, he's getting paid $100,000. That's winning the lottery. I mean, that's like, I don't know, 350,000 or something like that in today's exchange rate, basically, inflation rate. So he's making a ton of money. It's like, this is huge. So all of a sudden, he's got this money coming in. They back paid him to July the 1st. They've said, here you go, here's $5,000. You need some clothes. Go get some clothes. Things like that. All that kind of stuff is in the contract because they have to try and get him up to their level in a few different ways, and clothing is one of them. You can't have someone who's going, gee, I need gas money. I can't go to rehearsal. Right? You can't have that. So he's doing that kind of thing. But his contract was a little bit of back and forth. I do have a draft from July 22nd, and he basically had to give his whole life up for Kiss. They owned his name. He could never admit that he was in Kiss if he was fired, let go, or the band fell apart. He could never admit any of that. They owned all of the rights to his songs. He was not allowed to play with any other band, which kind of makes sense. If you're in Kiss and makeup, you can't go out and do that. And you have to act in a certain manner that is not disparaging to anything band. So if Ace gets into trouble and you get into trouble with Ace, we can fire you. Basically where it's going. So you got to be on your best behavior. Some of the things he did negotiate, though, he had now travel allowance that he could travel in business class with the band as opposed to back in economy because he's not the crew, even though he is an employee. So really, Kiss owned him. Kiss owned Eric Carr, down to his name, down to his persona, down to his makeup. He gave up everything. And hey, if this is what I'd wanted to do for my entire life and this opportunity is given to me, yeah, I'm going to take it.
Sure, I'm doing the same
But then
thing.
you got to think about that pressure as well, because I got to take it because Bobby Rondinelli's right there and nobody knows that he's not, right? If I don't cooperate, Bobby Rondinelli can take my place.
Sure, you can't negotiate. Take it or leave it.
Yeah.
This is your opportunity. By the way, inflation would bring it to about $395,000 a year today.
Yeah. So he's
not bad.
It's almost like winning the lottery, right? You're doing pretty darn good if all of a sudden you've gone from a tenth of that. But it was an amazing time for Eric because it was such a transformative time, but it was also a very short amount of time. He had 3 weeks to transform himself from being a gas range repairman and a drummer in a cover band to playing in Kiss, having the whole persona, knowing everything, knowing all the stage cues. I mean, learning the songs was probably not very difficult for him because he'd been doing it for the last 15 odd years. But then all of a sudden, he's got to know the stage cues and when to jump up and when to sit down and what Paul's going to do. And while he's, talking to the crowd and everything. So it's a very steep learning curve. And he also has to be very careful that he can remain fitting in with the others as well. But I think that's where his personality came in. So he didn't really have to try. It was just very natural for him.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this. Eric Carr's first show with Kiss was July 25th, 1980, right? Palladium, New York City.
Yep.
And he
New
wins
York
the
City.
crowd over. They start chanting Peter in the beginning, but by the end, they love him. And off we go. And he had to have been shocked when he was told what the plans were for the next Kiss album, because he had to have been so excited about, hey, we're going to make a rock and roll album, And it's the concept album, Music from the Elder. And according to the book, him and Ace oppose the idea. Now, Eric did have the chance to express his concerns to Gene and Paul. How did they react?
Well, you're a member of the band. Well, no, you're not a member of the band. So he's in that catch-22. He's like, well, I want to speak up, but gee, I'm an employee. So he did eventually speak his mind, and he said, we should really be doing a rock and roll album. And that's what he was expecting. That's what they started to do in February of 1981. They were working on some stuff that eventually came onto Killers. I think it was I'm a Legend Tonight that I'd have to look in the book, that they recorded during that time for The Elder. They did a few songs for that, and it didn't work out. It didn't work out at all. As Bill Coyne said in one of the interviews, that they were just tired of working together. No one was getting along. They didn't want to do the album. And he said, what am I going to do? We're contracted to have one album every 12 months. So the pressure's on there. So you got to have this album out, get going. And they had lost a lot of time because Peter had left in May of 1980, and that cut into their touring cycle. So that means that now they've put the tour off until August. So they've lost some of that touring cycle, so they can't do North America. And they get off the road in December from a really great concert series down in Australia and New Zealand. But they're probably exhausted as well because they've been at it for so long. And then they're told, well, great, you've had a few weeks off, start recording. And they didn't want to do it. So I don't understand why Bill turned to Bob Ezrin. To me, I would have turned to Eddie Kramer. Eddie did so many fantastic things. I mean, Eddie did the original Kiss demos back in '73. He did Rock and Roll Over, Love Gun. He did Ace's album. I mean, these are fantastic albums in the Kiss catalog. But he turned to Bob Ezrin instead. And Bob Ezrin was just having not a very good year, as we found out. And they decided that we're going to work together because Bob, as Bill said, knows the personalities, knows how to get everyone to get along together. Eric's scratching his head and saying, but I thought we wanted to do rock and roll. We're not Pink Floyd, and we're doing this weird concept album. So he did speak up, but he was basically told to, you're just a drummer. You do what you're paid to do. Start drumming. What can he say? I mean, you can't, right? Otherwise, well, there goes my job. And this is a job that I love. And he still hasn't toured North America. I mean, he's had a great world tour, but it's what he's always wanted to do. So he decides I'll keep my mouth shut and we'll just do this album. But he must have felt a bit hesitant doing some of it, but eventually he got into it. And there was apparently a list of songs that Bob Ezrin or Gene Symmons had put up on the wall. And one of them was called Under the Rose. And Eric looks at this and goes, oh, that's an interesting title. And so he goes off with his acoustic guitar and he wrote Under the Rose. He wasn't a very good lyricist. So he gave the music to Gene, and Gene said, this is great stuff. We will go in and we'll cut this. And Gene actually wrote the lyrics to it. And Eric may or may not have, it's still up in the air, played the acoustic guitar on the album cut for that. So he did get into it. I think he really shines in the song Escape from the Island. And that's a great song. It's got such a drive to it. You can hear he's got this double bass going, and Ace is just playing just like nobody else can. I mean, Ace is fantastic on that. And that was recorded in Toronto, north of Toronto, actually, in a little tiny room. It's a 10 by 10 room, and they were trying to squeak all of the equipment in. And it's just Ace and Eric and Bob Ezrin's playing bass. That's it. And they hit record and off they went. And that's a fantastic song. If you're looking at the timeline and people who are working on this album, particularly Bob had a lot to do with the direction that this album went in. And that is because he was also working, he'd worked on previous concept albums, very famous for doing The Wall, which sold, I don't know, how many million did that sell?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's huge. But he was also working with Lou Reed, and he worked on this album called Berlin, which was a concept album. In the book, I also line that up because it's very similar in the processes of the vision for it. Bob wanted Berlin to be like a Broadway theater type show. And now he's telling Kiss, we can do this movie. So you see so many parallels happening with those two albums. But also Bob's going through a really rough period. At the beginning of 1981, he's working with folk/country singer Murray McLaughlin, who's working in Nashville and New York at the time. They're recording there. And he's also contracted to work with a band called the Kings. And the Kings are a Canadian band. Well, Murray McLaughlin's also Canadian. And the Kings are a Canadian band. And they recently had a hit with a song called Switch Into Glide, which is a really cool song. And it was all over the radio up here in Canada. So they were a hot little band. So he's working with 3 bands. He's coming off the Murray McLaughlin album. He's going into the Kiss album, but he's also contracted to work with the Kings at the same time. And the Kings wound up using, I don't know how the timing actually worked on it, but they actually used all of the same studio and all of the same processes. And it seems like Bob was just bouncing back and forth from one to the other because the Kings were complaining Bob's never around. They wound up hiring another producer because Bob's never around. Well, then he's off working with Kiss. And Kiss is complaining that Bob's never around. That's because he's off working with the Kings. So he's bouncing back and forth. And he's also admitted he was going through some personal problems at the time, and he was having a little bit of a drug issue at the time. Putting it into context is huge because there's so many little bits and pieces that are starting to fall apart for Kiss, and they have no control over it because they didn't sign Bob to an exclusive production contract, right? So he's off working with the Kings. They were even using the mobile recording unit from the record plant, just like Kiss was. But what is interesting about that time period for Bob is Murray McLaughlin years later said, this is not my kind of thing. This wasn't a very good album. I don't play any songs from it anymore. Then you have the Kings, and it was interesting. I did a little research on them, and they were apparently touring across the country in a van or something, and they stopped into a record store and they saw their CD there. Like this was a few years ago. And they said, we'll take a listen to it. And they throw it in the van, throw it in the CD player in the van, and off they go down the highway. And they listen to the first couple of songs and they pitch the thing out the window. They still can't listen to it. They hate it. They won't play it. And actually, so did their record company. So you can see that what happened for Bob in 1981, he had a disastrous year. He's worked with 3 artists. Those are the only 3 artists he worked with that year. None of those 3 artists liked the outcome. The job of a producer, and he's brilliant. He's a brilliant producer, but I think something was wrong in Bob's life at the time because a good producer, according to Ted Templeman in his book by
Greg Renoff.
Greg Renoff. Yeah, that's a fantastic book. Love that book. And the Van Halen Rising book's absolutely fantastic too. Love that one. But Ted says, it's up to the producer to bring the best out of the band and the musicians. And I don't think that happened during that time period in Bob's life. I think that he was dictating, this is what I want you to do. Because the lead single from the Murray McLaughlin album, Tell Your Mother She Wants You, which is a euphemism to say, F off. It's got this gang chorus in it. It's not folk, it's not country. It's a great song. I started looking at that song because I had heard that Kiss had actually done the background vocals for it.
Oh, wow.
Because it was it was Bob, right? And they were all in the same studios, but the timing was a little bit off. So Eric and Kiss did not do the gang vocals there, but it's got that gang vocal and it's a really cool song. But nobody wants to hear this. He's a folk singer and he's doing rock. So you didn't pull the essence of the musician out for any of those 3 albums.
Another factor, too, is this is the end of Ace's run. Now, he hasn't left yet. He's still hanging on, right?
He's still hanging on, but when they decided, I'm going to outvote you, because Eric Carr does not have a vote, right? He's just a hired hand. Now, all of a sudden, Peter is gone, so there's no even out in the vote. So it's always going to be 2 against 1. And Bill's job was to basically break the tie. And I think Bill didn't really vote. I think he kind of talked people around to voting in certain directions if they were, loggerheads and the vote was tied. But now that's disappeared. So the very first time that there's a problem, Eric and Ace want to do a rock album. Paul and Gene are like, they don't know what they want to do. And then they come up with the concept. This isn't rock and roll, they both say. Well, we're not going to listen to Eric because he's a hired hand. He's a newbie. He's only played in the clubs. He's got 1 tour underneath his belt. So they're not going to listen to him. And Ace, well, we can just outvote you. And I think that was the beginning of the downfall for Ace in a professional sense, because I don't want to get into what else he was doing, like with in his personal life with drugs, alcohol, and all that other stuff. That's a whole other story, which he chronicles very well in his book, in his autobiography. But there's a definite problem there with Ace because you can see that he's so into it. I mean, Escape from the Island is fantastic. I love it. But at some point, he just says, enough of this. I'm tired of being told what to do. I'm leaving. And he leaves Toronto and he goes back to Connecticut. Fine. But when he does that, he also loses his voice in the say-so of what the band is doing. Just mail it to me, basically, is not being very proactive. At the end, he complains like, well, you cut my solos, or you did this, or you did that. Well, to me, that's partly Ace's fault. He should have taken responsibility for it. And even though it wasn't a very good situation for him, if you leave that situation, you cannot stand up for yourself. So you don't like the solo? You weren't there. So
Yeah.
that's my take on it. Now he's lost his artistic ability within the band because now it's dictated to him. This is the finished product. And if you don't like it, we don't have time to fix this. We're already running so late because they kept putting it off, and they had to get this thing out by May. And there was just no way they were going to do that because that's when Unmasked was released at the end of May 1980. So an album every year. They needed The Elder out by May 1981, and they didn't do that. So the record companies then are looking at it and saying, well, we have options. So we can now release a greatest hits. Now we can do this. Now we can do that. Julian Gill really gets into that. He's got a really good, his last book really gets into all of that kind of interesting stuff. I didn't get into the contracts for Kiss that much because that's not where I'm focusing. But it does have a bearing on the pressure that the band is under at the time. So throughout the summer, they're trying to push back against the record company. The record company is getting ticked off because they just spent a pile of money to buy out Casablanca Records. They want their money back, and the only way they're going to get their money back is to get Kiss selling records and the back catalog. So what do you have? You got an album that's coming out in October. It was delivered on 1st of October, 2nd of October. It's so late, but in a way it's good timing because it's there for the Christmas rush. But yeah, the Kiss is in everybody's bad books by that time. The record company's ticked off with them, and Bill's probably swiping his forehead. Oh, thank God that thing's over. Finally got this thing recorded. It was a bit of a mess all the way around. Because of The Elder, it was basically the last straw of working with Bill Aucoin. So Gene and Paul said goodbye to Bill. I don't know if Ace had any input into that because by the end of March, he had decided he was going to leave. Here's my resignation. And now we have to untangle this legal mess that we've created called Kiss. I want out. So he's delivered his resignation for then. And they're saying, okay, we have a year to untangle this. And then he's definitely gone. So that is, I don't know, March 31st, I guess. And then in April, they say goodbye to Bill. They have to also figure out what they want to do for their next album because they're in crisis mode. The Elder was a flop. But before Bill left, and this is back in the middle of January, so they're already thinking about the next album because they know well the Elder isn't doing that well. So January 1982, Michael James Jackson is brought into the picture. And Bill actually has them meet with Kiss at the time that they're recording. No, they're doing the live version of Fridays, January 17th. So that's the first time that Michael James Jackson meets Gene and Paul. By having Bill introduce Michael James Jackson to Gene and Paul prior to leaving, it's one of the best things that Bill ever did is he set them up for success for the next several years. Because introducing Michael James Jackson to Kiss, they also found Adam Mitchell as a songwriter who wrote 2 songs on Killers. Can't remember which one, Partners in Crime, I think. You have it probably right in front of you.
In front of me here. Let's see. Adam Mitchell co-wrote I'm a Legend Tonight with Paul. By the way,
Partner.
Bryan Adams, part of the songwriting team for Down on Your Knees. Bryan Adams. Let's see.
Who wasn't famous yet.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, he was working on the pre-production at that point for Cuts Like a Knife, which was the one that broke him internationally.
Yeah.
So
Partners in Crime, Paul Stanley, and it's credited to Stanley Mitchell.
Yeah. So, and Adam Mitchell knew Michael James Jackson, and that's how he was brought in to the fold, the writing fold. They ran into Bryan Adams while they were doing pre-production. They just happened to be in the same studio more than anything. So that was happenstance. But Michael James Jackson went on to work with Kiss later on in 1987 for Crazy Nights, that album as well. So in a way that set them up for the next almost the decade, because you have Michael James Jackson is going to work with them on Killers, which came directly after The Elder. They had to get that out really quickly, and it was only released in non-North American markets, and it was different tracks as well for different markets. So the track listing in Japan is going to be different than the one in Australia and different than the one in Europe. And that was to meet contractual obligations and fill that void, to also let people know that, hey, Kiss is still here. They can still rock. But most importantly, is it sold? It had better numbers than The Elder, for Pete's sake. It's like, wow, this is saying something about how The Elder was received by the fans. But it also told Polygram that this is still a viable group. They can still sell albums. So let's get them back in the studio. And that's where it leaves off. The book leaves off just as they're, okay, we're at a crossroads now. If we don't deliver, we're in real big trouble, because if we do another Elder, we may not have a record contract.
They make an album that I'm sure Eric was so happy with for two reasons. One, it's a flat out rock album, hard rock album, but two,
Yep.
he attains that bottom sound, which I'm sure you'll get to in the
Yep.
next volume, which is Drums of Thunder, 1982 to 1986. And there is a preview in the first volume, right at the end?
Yeah, so in both the hardcover and the paperback. For the preview, I think I had him in the studio. He was trying out different studios. Gene and Eric just went to a bunch of different studios in LA, and they were, let's set up the drum and the bass and let's see what they sound like. And they went into one studio, didn't quite work. And Eric said, well, let's open up this door. And it made the shape of the room slightly different. And it was like, wow, that sounds like a gunshot now. My snare sounds like a gunshot. It's just got that snap to it. And he did a rumble on the bass drums, and it was just perfect. So that's how that all came about. And then, of course, you're going to have the rest of, it's all about miking and the different types of drums you're using. And then, of course, the mastering and everything else. So
is there an expected release date for the next volume? Do you know?
I'm trying to get this out in about a year. Obviously, as you can see, there's work done on it. It's in pretty good shape. I am trying to get a couple of more, and I won't tell you who, a couple of more interviews that I think will really round out what's happening for those albums. So that the next book will cover Creatures, Lick It Up, which was also produced by Michael James Jackson. Then we have Analyze and Asylum. So it's going to cover 4 albums. And there's a lot going on there, because just looking at the pictures of Eric, you can see that all of a sudden he's gone from this 8-piece or whatever drum kit that's nice and silver and shiny to all of a sudden this kit that seems to explode. It's got all these electronic drums in it and so many more pieces as well. So I'll be looking at him as the evolution of a drummer as well. And I do touch upon that in this book, because I wanted to get into the superhero thing and the drum thing, because being a drummer, it just fascinates me. I'm not a drummer. I'm not a musician by any means. But if you think about it, you got to keep time. You're singing. Your hands and feet are going all over the place. How do you do that? And to dive into some of the history of the drums, like I did in this book, like I talk about how the double bass came about. Ginger Baker and Keith Moon went out to see a jazz band, Duke Ellington's jazz band. And hey, that guy's playing double bass. This is so cool. And that's how it came into rock and roll.
There's a YouTube channel too, right? The Eric Carr Revealed YouTube channel.
Yeah, what I do with the YouTube channel is I have little snippets of interviews. I did not do these interviews. Nothing on there belongs to me. Copyright, I don't own any of it. And I just take little snippets of these interviews and I put them up. And then I put a little bit of trivia and some background and some, interesting stuff to it, and photos of what it is that I'm talking about, or what it is Eric is talking about in these interviews. So yeah, I do that. And I'm also on Facebook quite a lot, on the Eric Carr Revealed Facebook page. I have people who have reading my book and they're sending me questions. I had someone ask me yesterday about the makeup that we were just talking about in the photos. So on page 40, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, yeah, so I sent the photos to him. So yeah, I'm very interactive with the fans that way. And I think there's just so much that Eric has to offer that people just don't know about. And putting it up on Facebook and on YouTube just opens up the world for Eric Carr fans and Kiss fans in general, because understanding, it's like I said in the book, it's like the origins of a superhero. because of the costuming and all that, and how that affected his personality. And that can come out in some of these comments that are on the Facebook page, and also what you'll find on the YouTube channel. So there's more coming, and it's going to be just as detailed as this. I'm going to open up his personality a bit more, because we have that superhero persona that's all of a sudden taken away with the makeup. We got his evolution of drumming. We got a whole bunch of stuff coming up.
Well, one last thing to ask you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what do you think of what did you think of the quote unquote final Kiss show? And what do you think of this Avatar thing? There was no mention of Eric or any of the past members in that last show.
Well, the reason they don't have anything for Eric is because they don't own him anymore. So what happened with that is, I can't remember what year it was. I'd have to think. Was that 2003? Maybe something like that. The patent for Eric's Fox makeup, they didn't renew it. Kiss did not renew it. And Vinnie Vincent wound up purchasing it. So they don't own anything for Eric. I'm not too sure if they still own Eric Carr's name. I'm getting the hint that they don't, because Loretta has trademarked his signature. So I don't think that Kiss can do anything without a licensing agreement at this point. I don't know if Vinnie still owns the Eric Carr makeup, the Fox makeup. And if you remember back in, I think it was 2001 or 2, they had they called them the Creatures of the Night, the McFarlane dolls, the little 8-inch dolls, and they were dressed up in the unmasked costumes. And Eric had his old Fox makeup, the original one that he had used for the People magazine cover, not the one that he used throughout the rest of his career, because Kiss can't use that, because they don't have the rights to use that. So that is probably why there's no Eric Carr Avatar, because they no longer have the rights to it. I don't know why they decided to do that, why they gave it all up, to each their own. But I don't think you're going to hear a whole lot of anything about Eric Carr from Kiss, because he's no longer part of the Kiss family, because they don't own him anymore. The avatars are quite interesting. I can see them being a younger version of themselves would be really cool. I'd love to be back. I saw Creatures of the Night tour. It's fantastic. I'd love to do it again. Please give me that. I'd also love to be in the Alive era. I'd love to be in the audience for that as well.
Right.
That'd be so cool. Give me that. What they've done now with the avatars is they've made them into superheroes, right? You can just see that by the way that Gene is flying through the air with the wings and things like that. So they're carrying on that superhero tradition, which is perfect for them. I mean, if you look at what they did with the comic books and the Kiss Meets the Phantom, and the movie that they did, their comic book come to life. So unfortunately, Eric won't be part of that. In my estimation, I don't think he'll be part of that, because he's no longer part of the Kiss family.
The Rise of the Fox, 1950 to 1982, The Extraordinary Life of Kiss's second drummer, Eric Carr Revealed. Where can people find the book?
The people can find that book on Amazon. It's available worldwide as a paperback, as a hardcover, and as an ebook. It will be out on Barnes & Noble in the States. Paperback version beginning of January, the first week of January, and later on in January, it will be out on Apple Books.
And I'll make sure I put the link to your YouTube channel and also the Facebook page so people can reach out to you.
Oh, yeah. Just message me on my Facebook page, the Eric Carr Revealed Facebook page. I'm happy to interact with people. And, if you have a question, I'd be happy to answer it to the best of my ability.
Janet Symmons, the author of The Rise of the Fox, and no relation to Gene, right?
No, this is my real last name. That's not his real last name.
Yeah. Janet, thanks so much.
It's great that you're such an Eric Carr fan. And I think it's great that people are still interested in him 33 years after his death. So thank you so much.
That's it. It's in the books.